The spread is probably directly related to the explosion of population size. There have been some interesting computer simulations. I'd like to point out, in nature, and this is also interesting, in nature, human females have approximately 21 pregnancies in their fertility cycle. Okay? And my students often will say, 21 babies? No, 21 pregnancies, which means that, and interestingly, we know now that pregnancy, on average, in nature, doesn't usually become viable until the females are approximately what we would call the age of 20, which is interesting. Right? So you've got this long period of time in which girls are having sex, but not getting pregnant. Interesting, Margaret Mead, in Coming of Age in Samoa, was often asked, if they're all having sex all over the place, how come they're not getting pregnant? She, as Margaret Mead, I knew her.
Malarossi makes that observation, and there's no explanation.
Yeah, and Margaret Mead's answer was, they don't think they can get pregnant, so they don't get pregnant. That was Margaret Mead.
But there were natural contraceptives, there were herbs.
The interesting thing is, there's been studies done in this. The interesting thing is, and this was always the case going back when they went to look at it, to say, well, maybe they pull out, maybe they don't do this, they have natural contraceptives, maybe they're having abortions behind bushes and you don't know about it. None of this bears it out. Recently, there have been some very interesting recent studies in immunology and hormonal research which shows that females cannot bear viable pregnancy, right? Doesn't mean they can't get pregnant, but viable pregnancy requires a particular ratio of fat to cervical size in the body. And until that balance produces the right hormonal balance, you're not going to have a successful pregnancy. Now, in nature, the amount of fat that you can get, right, on your bone over a period of time takes a long time to build up enough fat. In our society, right, and this might also relate to why, why menstruation is getting earlier and earlier. In our society, of course, you could go outside right now and get enough fat for the to bring animal fat to bring you up to whatever you need at any time. So it's a very, very modern, and not just modern now, but I think about 10 or 15,000 years ago, something began to change in terms of tech. I mean, we could spend huge amounts of time looking at
timeline. When does agriculture begin?
Well, that's also debatable. Contrary to the standard thing that you'll be taught in often a history class, when agriculture actually begins to evolve, it has a lot to do with when horticulture first emerges. And then when that is, the safe bet is someplace around 50,000 years ago, things start shifting and changing. By 30,000 years ago, you begin to see monumental shift towards these kinds of complex, large populations moving, expanding, extending out, and then you begin to get more and more complex societies. And when you look at the archaeological evidence and the demographic spreads, you're not talking, and what's astounding, it's been shocking to many of the new anthropological and archaeological evidence, is you don't see, this idea that gradually you have bigger and bigger communities that are more complex. You actually see, as 12,000, 20,000 years ago now, you're uncovering sites that are highly complex, hugely expanded, very, very large, huge populations supporting large numbers with complex systems that are clearly in place for social organization that are no longer humans in nature, as we understand it. And they're no longer hunters and gatherers. Although some of these large communities appear to be primarily hunters and gatherers, even though they were very large. But how they did that and exactly what hunting and gathering was by that time is not exactly clear.
I just want to say that theory of fertility really makes sense in relation to anorexic young women, because they lose their periods.
It all supports that. It supports the fact that usually, girls particularly who are very, very thin and very, very active dancers or in sports often have irregular periods, have problems with their menstruation, have problems with fertility. That all said, what my point is that once you get to that kind of social, and here's where, the topic becomes the thing. So once you get to the issue of a social organization that begins to become much more complex, much more variable, and in my terms, or I think in ergonomic terms, more armored, in which not only, before we look at the individual, but the society begins to demand conditions for membership that require learning how to organize yourself around specific rules and regulations and conditions. Therefore, you need to internalize them. You need to, you need to be educated. You need to be properly taught, as as the song goes, right? You need to learn these rules, right? And these rules have to be internalized. They have to be internalized both emotionally, but they also have to be internalized physically. You're going to have to learn how to tolerate, right, the cessation or interference to some degree with your natural biological function. You're going to need to learn how to, basically tolerate the blocking of natural sexual pulsation, right? Or you're going to have to learn how to live with greater levels of anxiety. Now, some of that, this is not to say that that's always bad. I mean, some of that's necessary. Living in a more complex social organization sometimes brings benefits, and you might have to delay gratification. You might have to learn how to operate in ways that are not always, instantly gratifying and don't always lead to immediate, pleasure. And you might have to learn to be able to tolerate some degree of anxiety. So by the time you look at the Trobrians, for instance, I think Reich is saying these people are doing pretty well. It's not a bad organization, it's not a bad balance. They trade off certain things, but they get other things. But by the time we look at modern, if we bring it up to what we're looking at in terms of what Reich is responding to in the sexual struggle of youth, or these problems, we're looking at a very different picture. We are now looking at highly complex social structures which are no longer really generated by natural biological, energetic function, but are really imposed on natural energetic function from the moment, really, and Reich became increasingly more convinced that this was imposed on our organisms not in adolescence, or not as we become pubescent, but literally at conception. So, not even at birth, but conception, that the nature of energetic restriction begins to become basically organized in the very function of the physical and biological, and then becomes absolutely easily transitioned into the social organization, so that the baby is already, ironically, at birth, prepared in some ways to begin to accept a kind of level of anxiety or disequilibrium than the natural you would expect a natural organism to tolerate. Fascinating, when you look at hunters and gatherers, one of the most distinct, someone wrote was an interview with an anthropologist who said that the most fascinating thing about going into a Kung Bush tribal group, right, was that you never heard babies crying. Right? When you ask Kung Bush people why, they would tell you very directly, it's the Dr. Spock moment, right? They would say, well, because when a baby cries, you have to make it happy. And if you said to them in your typical Western assumption, well, sometimes babies have to cry, they would say, no. Babies were made to laugh, not to cry, and if the baby's crying, it's because there's something wrong. Well, maybe what's wrong is that they're just bored. Well, that's terrible. They shouldn't be bored. That means they want you to play with them, and that's what they do. So I don't want to romanticize